now part of the discussions that occur every time someone approaches us. And these are typical nonprofit, other organizations within our community, the Chamber of Commerce. And having to educate them when I joined and had a legacy of, oh yeah, we've been doing this for 10 years. Okay, so now do you own the content? Who's got the copyright at the end? Who signs the agreement?
Yeah,
For
whose speech is the content?
Exactly right.
Whose speech is the content? Whose speech is the channel? All of those are key questions that need to be determined almost in every instance.
And sometimes it's based on a risk analysis. Do we want to take responsibility for this content, or are we trying to shield ourselves from this content?
Mm-hmm. Jeff, is this an easy question for organizations to address?
No.
Thank you. Good night, everybody. All right.
That's my simple lawyer answer. But no, and it really depends not only on the type of content, where it's being published. Is this online? Are we talking about on your website? Are we talking about things that are being hosted up, on YouTube, on other social media? Who and how is doing that posting, the comments involved, and also the nature of the access organization. I mean, the Halleck case Mike was talking about earlier didn't get into these broader questions of when are public access channels, protected First Amendment open forums or not. And it kind of dodged the question saying, the specific question here, we can deal with based on the facts here. Is it the actual government running it? Is it a nonprofit? What are their policies in terms of who gets to come in? What kind of control do we have over that and what goes out? So that all depends. How it's being published, how it's getting out there, where it's getting out there. And you could have different answers for different content and in different places.
How important is it in our communities for there to be expression forums that are hosted and moderated in a fair and equitable fashion? Maybe I can turn this to Mickey a little bit. How important is it for us to have those expression forums as opposed to simply identifying as publishers?
It's extraordinarily important.
Actually, Chris, I don't know if we're having a problem with your audio here, Mickey. So hold on a second.
Check.
Okay.
Check.
Okay.
How about now?
Doesn't seem to be feeding out. Drop.
Nope. Everything seems fine at this end. How about with you all? Mike?
Okay. We're going to keep working here. Let me turn that question to you, Tracy. How important is it for us to have those forums at this point, do you think?
Well, it's important because really there's relatively few other portals to whatever you would consider mass media. I mean, if you look at broadcast television, if you look at radio, if you look at newspapers, they don't really have easy portals or entrances to them. And as media has consolidated everyone, that's become even less and less the case. So really, it's one of the few ways that people can communicate in a broader way. Now, of course, we have the internet, but as you all know, you make a video and pop it up on YouTube. How many people watch it on average? A couple dozen, a couple hundred if you get really lucky. And of course, on a cable system, you're talking potentially to thousands and thousands of people at one shot. So, it remains, even as things are changing and we're kind of in a fluxy kind of environment with media and things are changing kind of rapidly, it still remains one of the entry points to mass media. And C-SPAN is like our government access channel, and what it does basically is it's the only place that shows you what's happening with a limited amount of punditry, curating, and commentary. At least that's the idea. And you are providing that kind of service in your own communities. If you're with a with a G channel, that is basically one of the few places to observe the government in action without having it refracted by a strong perspective one way or the other.
Okay, Mickey, I think we've got you connected here. Can we hear you? Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Beautiful. Welcome, Mickey Huff from Project Censored.
Sorry so much.
So let's throw the question to you. How important is it for us to have those expression forums in our communities?
I think that it's among the most important things that we really need to have in order to have what even remotely looks like a functioning democracy. I think that part of what we see in the particularly the corporate media landscape is very narrow and myopic, and it doesn't really represent the views, the diverse views of people in local communities, which is what makes these community access media centers, access channels so significant. Things like community radio. I think more and more, as we've seen this consolidation and news deserts and sort of a locking down, if you will, in some ways, of avenues of expression, the population in general is A, tuning out from establishment and legacy media, and B, getting increasingly frustrated with its content. But I want to go to C, and that's people. I think a lot of people feel as though that they're not being accurately heard. They're maybe not being accurately represented. They and we do this both at Project Censored, and another book that I just had come out on Rutledge with Nolan Higdon is called Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy. And I think what we need is a multi-pronged approach through education, critical media literacy, community-based grassroots journalism and media, ethical journalism that follows the code of ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists. And I think we in the communities are the people that need to be modeling the kinds of discussions, hard discussions, debates, and so forth, because the corporate media isn't, and they're not going to. They are the low-hanging fruit. They're interested in what's sensational. They're interested in driving wedges through cultural issues. They are interested in distraction, United States of distraction, media manipulation, and post-truth America. And what we can do about it, well, part of what we can do about it is what everyone's doing here this weekend, is that, we really need to have a mobilized plan. We need to work with, local communities, community government, community colleges, public schools. We really need to fill the gap of these news deserts. And, again, in many cases, we can't really ignore the corporate media. They're so ubiquitous and they're so powerful. But we really need to rely on them less and not expect them to model what productive or healthy or constructive dialogue looks like. And I think that's where community centers, local media, nonprofits, that's really the void that I think we're left to fill. And it's a Herculean task, as everybody here knows. But I think we have to roll up our sleeves and really, really make it happen.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds to me, Mickey, like you're calling for building civic communication infrastructure. Communication infrastructure is devoted to civic communications, so that democracy can thrive at the local and the regional and national level. Is that fair representation?
It's a very fair representation. And I know a lot of groups and folks have been working on these things in different ways for a long time. And it feels like herding cats in many ways, to use the cliche. But I think that we really need to build bigger networks, better networks, and put aside some of our ideological differences for what I think is the more important challenge before us. And that is to create these open forums for people to be heard, seen, listened to, and so forth. And we use those as vehicles to drive our societal conversations.
I want to pick up on one word that Mickey just used as he talked about his forums. And it's not a speech forum, but a forum where you can be heard, which seems to me to be very, very different from the sort of sensationalization that happens within media structures now, right? As we talk about hate speech, trolls, robots that are responding, there seems to be an amping up of the sensationalism and hype within our system, and in some cases because of the monetization of our system, that drives that type of behavior, as opposed to there's no money in being heard, right? So can you speak to that a little bit, Tracy?
Yeah, I think it's really significant, Mike, that you sort of use the word amping up, because my whole argument here is that sort of things have been things that we're kind of familiar with, because hate speech is not brand new. but it's been sort of amped up and monetized in a way that didn't really exist in quite the same way before. So when I look at sort of like what's old and what's new here, I mean, there's a couple of things that we've seen for decades. The use of sort of, you know, divide and conquer stuff where sort of targeted groups are kind of set against each other. Most of us would say cynically. So, so the revolution will never come. But, you know, divide and conquer is an old tactic and an old strategy. Sensationalism sells. We used to call it, if it bleeds, it leads. And that, of course, is partially about them and it's partially about us, because what they're doing is measuring what we're looking at, what we're clicking on, what we're engaging with. And often we tell a different story with what we do than perhaps with what we say that we want. And of course, the issue of kind of censorship, which is basically that it always sort of seems to end up hitting in the end, even though, you know, it starts from good intentions, the alternative, the unconventional, the revolutionary, the adventurous. And truth, I hate to say it, is kind of fungible sometimes, in the sense that, you know, there's the stuff like the earth is flat. Okay, we've got that that's not true. But there's any number of things that in the time are often seen as kind of fringy or wild, but actually turn out 10 years or 20 years or 50 years or 100 years down the line to have been the truth. You know, that's, conspiracies are sometimes entirely accurate. And that's all sort of established stuff. But then you get to, okay, so what are we in the middle of now? Like, why is this different? And, you know, it comes back to what Mike was talking about, which is we have this kind of machine intelligence sort of driving the ecosystem with artificial intelligence and algorithms and bots and troll farms. And what it basically does is it's an automated kind of distribution, and it happens at a speed and a scale that the world has never seen before. And so we basically take something that is familiar and we sort of blow it up to 100 times its previous impact. And then we sort of see how our society has trouble absorbing it, not because it never happened before, but because it's happening so much more intensely, widely, quickly, and sort of, you know, almost faster than we can process and kind of deal with. And so we start to fracture a bit, I think.
So, you know, I guess one of the questions I've got is the extent to which, I mean, I want to unpack one of the points that you just raised, Stacy, about censorship, and it has to do with the relationship with power.
Mhm.
And the extent to which censorship often is affecting people who don't have power, right?
Mhm.
And we don't often talk, but we often absent the question sort of power relations from questions of censorship. We talk about it in sort of an idealized fashion. I mean, this even kind of gets to the sort of discussion that happens about, I hate using these terms. It's just the worst cliche, cancel culture, which I think it's like a made up bogus
not do
bullshit
that.
term, right? In terms of people taking responsibility for their words and actions in the world, and sort of absenting from sort of like how power relations work. And this is happening at the same time that across the country, I would say that there's a crisis about banning words and ideas, particularly from public institutions and libraries, right? So do we have, I mean, just for each of you here, do we have a firm handle of how censorship works in America or not? I mean, I think it very much has to do with where you lie in power and what seat you're in, and whether or not you are you know, using it as a weapon against your enemy or not. And I guess I'm just gonna gauge your senses of this across the room. Jeff, you're about to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think a great example is what you just brought up about cancel culture, which is this, you know, boogeyman we hear about. People are getting canceled, you know, and actually profiting off of it and all of that. And if you look at,
I'm going to sell a T-shirt that says I've been canceled. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, or just go on, you know, my own website, my own platform, you know, the powerful people who are getting canceled get other platforms. You know, when Facebook bans Donald Trump from their platform, it doesn't hurt his ability to speak. You know, if he puts out a press statement, he can set up his own website. People are going to find what he has to say. I think a good example of censorship in practice, you know, coming at it from the legal side, we can get into kind of the background on these online platforms later. Law that came out a couple of years ago, Sesta Fosta, which was, you know, great intentions from Congress targeting sex trafficking. And it amends, you know, part of the law that deals with civil liability for these companies. And what do? They have, you know, their lawyers see this new law. We could be facing massive liability. We're going to clamp down on speech. And, you know, not just, you know, the terrible stuff facilitating sex trafficking, but anything that kind of comes close on that. And who does that hurt? That, you know, hurts sexual expression, particularly, you know, on more marginalized groups. It shuts down forums where sex workers were sharing information to keep each other safe, pushing them to either darker parts of the internet or out in the real world where they were facing these issues on their own. And those are the people who are actually hurt by, you know, censorship, getting their speech clamped down in response to this change in law coming out of Congress, you know, with the best of intentions. But they're the ones kind of facing the impacts of censorship, not these powerful figures who may be kicked off a platform temporarily, but still have, you know, the ability to get their speech out there.
Mickey, what's your perspective on this question?
Thanks. I'd certainly like to jump in here. I'm of course opposed to censorship, and there is something called cancel culture. We can argue about how it's defined and who it impacts and to what degree. And I think it's important that the nuances and gray areas of this are recognized. You know, take a look at the Foundation of Individual Rights and Education, Greg Lukianoff. Yes, I'm aware they get funded from some right-wing sources, but they also do a lot of work across the ideological spectrum in favor of academic freedom and free expression in public spaces. And I think it's very significant to note that they make an argument. So does Dan Kovalik, human rights lawyer. You know, the book on Cancel This Book, you know, the progressive case against cancel culture. I think what we just heard a moment ago is the real lesson here is that when we see people in the liberal class celebrate the deplatforming, euphemistic word, of people like Trump from Twitter or like Alex Jones from social media, there's rounds of great applause, and that I suppose on certain levels that's understandable. And we could get into the weeds about toxic speech and hate speech and its ramifications, because that's very important and serious. But if you take a good look historically, whenever we see these celebrations of bringing down major figures, what usually happens is it comes back around to bite the left, to bite progressives. After we saw the trial balloon of Alex Jones cancellation a couple of years ago, over 800 progressive left, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist sites were disappeared. Real people were demonetized. They basically had their channels shut down. We see the same thing happening in the past couple of weeks with the shuttering of RT. The US government did not shut down RT America. Corporations did. Roku did. DirecTV did. The Russiagate hysteria and Russia-phobia, Spinal Tap turned up to 11 since the 2016 election, has really led to this kind of hysteria, where you now have Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists like Chris Hedges being deplatformed. I just interviewed him the other day, and he doesn't have another place to go. He's at ScheerPost, which is, you know, it is what it is. Robert Scheer is a great journalist. But these are important platforms. And just like Voice of America was a platform for Václav Havel when he couldn't speak, and, you know, going back into that era historically, we have to understand that the public, when educated through critical media literacy education and curriculum, should be able to discern fact from fiction. And propaganda comes in many guises, in many shapes. And it comes from all corners. And I think that when we get sloppy thinking about some of these things, I think that's when we can slide into a position where we're more vulnerable to having the most marginalized voices among us silenced or less hearable. And so I'm not pretending that there aren't a bunch of nuanced arguments here. And I know Tracy, and I know that there can be things that will be said here. But I just wanted to put that out here, that YouTube just demonetized and deplatformed my colleagues and my friends, Abby Martin, 600 shows of Breaking the Set disappeared, 6 years of On Contact, which if we actually had a real public media system in this country, you'd be able to see Chris Hedges' intellectual interviews with authors and academics, maybe at midnight or 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, but it would still be there. But what drives these voices and these people to these other outlets? This is, again, what I said earlier about community media filling those voids. Here's the opportunity. Instead of pushing people to foreign government or state government, other medias, other places, we should be using these opportunities to build up community media in a way that it really does provide and promote a space for these dissident voices. This isn't about agreement. In fact, quite the contrary. It's about contributing rich information to the dialogue so that we can have the better ideas rising to the surface, not based on money and not based on how sensational they are, but based on the merits of the argument that's being logically put forward and factually vetted in a public way. That may sound ideal. It may sound like some may think I'm disconnected from reality, but I think that these networks, these communication centers, public media in general, these are the points where I think we need to be really need to be not just louder, but more articulate. And we need to use the resources we have to our advantage, because otherwise Alphabet, Google, YouTube, Meta, Facebook, Instagram, that is where people go to get information. But we can't cede the sort of neoliberal collapse of the public sphere, the capturing of the commons, if you will, by this handful of big tech and corporations that are trying to really guide, shape the conversations we have. And major corporations that work with NewsGuard, like the Atlantic Council is somehow a fact checker at Facebook, even though they're PR arm of NATO. These are real serious problems. So I would just say that when we're outsourcing, our critical thinking, and we're outsourcing fact checking, and when we are, only selectively looking at who's canceled and what the ramifications are, I think we're missing the bigger opportunity to really promote media in the public interest.
So let me turn to you, Richard, on this question. It's kind of dovetail directly from what Mickey was talking about. Practically, what's the implications for you running a media center in Westminster, Maryland, when you think about the things that Mickey's putting forward?
Well, it's the same whether it's in Westminster, Maryland, or any place else, quite honestly. Just a first quick reflection on deplatforming. I think it's a misdirection. It focuses on the speaker rather than on the platform. What's wrong with the platform that creates the environment under which the problem exists? We built, our philosophy of public access channels around an electronic commons, a place where amplification didn't necessarily exist other than what you could reach by voice in that space, right? So if you went into the commons, the central town square, or if you were in Harlem and put up your ladder and were a stepladder preacher, you could be heard within a distinction of your voice. So now when we take the electronic commons and say, oh, well, because you're using the public rights of way, we want to extend the public commons into that electronic venue, which is editorially controlled by a cable operator, and extend that commons into that space. So going back to one of your original questions, I think it is significantly important to retain and invest in those common spaces where dialogue can occur without distortion. Deplatforming, the concept around deplatforming is because there's distortion. How do we ensure that there is a sense of authentic and genuine communication, dialogue, debate, comes with that level of trusted space? And so the focus on practicality is how do we create a trusted space? And so to get to that, it's important to understand what we do in our centers through the front door is different than what we talk about in terms of distribution of speech. Because I think the theme here is about how does hate speech have an impact on what we do on a day-to-day basis as a practitioner of encouraging people to come in and express themselves. I think that when people come through that front door, I have to be aware of, how are they aware of what needs to be done in order to retain a safe space? How can I facilitate a safe space? And yet enable the broadest level of possible debate around those issues so that the conspiracy theory that might in fact be true could be heard.
Well, and that, I mean, I hate to get back to Halleck. That's my problem with the Halleck decision, actually, is that there's a conflation of the organization with the channel. And the forum that you provide for expression as opposed to the forum that the organization that's created for creation. And, you know, Brett Kavanaugh was never going to get that. So, but so what you're saying is that it's important for an organization to be sort of a public steward to create a space for people to be expressing themselves, regardless of where they're from, regardless of what their beliefs are, regardless of how they look, regardless of their ability.
And at the same time, ensure that that person's ability that may have a greater sense of privilege and power, which are usually when we have like first come, first serve simplistic mechanisms of dealing with our users, right? We see this language. We have to recognize that the first ones to the door are likely privileged and empowered. And the individuals who we need to ensure that we are reaching and creating a safe space for have been disenfranchised or underrepresented. What are the mechanisms that create a greater sense of equity to lift up those opportunities? Now, in so doing, do I become more of a publisher? Because in fact, they may say, you know, I'm not about learning how to run and operate a camera or what's the best microphone or lighting angle. But I still have a story that's reflective of my experience in my community that if it were not shared, I have a lesser understanding of how to be compassionate and address the quality of life issues in my community.
But well, let me just kind of give you a hypothetical example. I'm not becoming a publisher if I extend training resources to community members who don't have the free time to be able to come down to my studio, am I?
Well, the question
mean,
is,
like, you know,
well, to give you an idea,
Right.
what we established an oral history project. We create the forum, we provide the interviewers, we provide what we think is a neutral method to ensure that their story comes out in an unfiltered fashion. But to a degree, it's still somewhat filtered. It's through a technological medium. Is that not pushing me into the gray, from the gray zone to a clearer issue that I'm being a publisher by that act of creating that process rather than just having an open door mechanism of first come, first serve. Here's the camera.
So there's one other question I want to have each of you address before I kind of open it up for the group here for questions from the crowd. And this is something that was sort of, it was in Mickey's response just a moment or two ago. And I think if I can paraphrase you, Mickey, you said something like, if we have a media literate society, and I would posit to you that we do not have a media literate society. Right. And even, I mean, so I think there's a greater challenge then that if we want to get to that point and that ideal, you know, teaching people how to be able to be consumers of media has to be part of our charge. Would you guys agree with that?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different rights here. We talk about the right to free speech, and I think that Richard sort of correctly pointed out that sort of the historical antecedent of that right is going out to a public space, yelling as loud as you can, or handing out your pamphlet to everyone that goes by. And what happens now on the electronic circuit is really very, very different than that. It's not quite the same thing. So the right of speech vis-a-vis the right of distribution on various outlets, the right of amplification, the right for your content to go viral. Those are rights that sometimes we take in like, how dare you deplatform me? But like, did you really, is that really what the fundamental right is? Is the fundamental right to be on a certain platform in a certain way? For example, at your access center, does anyone have a fundamental right to be on during prime time, for example? They might want to be, but you're gonna make a choice about the programs that are gonna be on at particular times of day, especially in a public access station. And sometimes the right to be distributed in the way that one might want to is conflated with the right to speak at all. And there are gradations of those kinds of rights. Mike's question was sort of the truth will out. And I mean, I would posit that if that's the case, and that's the idealistic version, right? We're in a marketplace of ideas, and those that have merit will rise to the top. I mean, if that were the case, we'd probably have I'll say something slightly, but I hope not too controversial. We'd probably have a 95% COVID vaccination rate in this state. We don't. So what part of the truth will out, failed us here? And I think we have to kind of, understand that it's not working exactly like the free speech model, and think about, why that's the case. And we haven't talked a lot about hate speech, and I think that we should talk about that a little with the rest of the panel, because I think that's one of the things that upsets the apple cart. And I'm pretty sure that people that have access operations have had people interact with their operations with something that certainly brought up the issues of, is this hate speech? And if so, what do I do?
Well,
And
I
think we've
how
sort
do you,
of
how do you,
not
how do
touched
you,
on that
yeah,
much.
well, let's talk about that a little bit before you open up then.
Yeah.
So how should an access center address questions of hate speech that come up from viewers, that they see something on a channel that they find objectionable?
Yeah, and how do you tell if it's hate speech?
How do you
or
tell if it's hate speech?
just something you don't like very much?
Jeff, is there a definition of hate speech?
In other countries, yeah, other countries have a very different approach to free speech. In European countries, Germany will ban, the Nazi swastika, and you don't have that same kind of issue in the United States, given the First Amendment. I mean, you have certain hate crimes, which is not quite the same thing.
Mhm.
But in terms of constitutionally protected speech, it's a very limited category, actual fighting words. I mean, the idea is, my freedom to swing my fist goes as far as your nose, and in some sense, that makes sense. Your right to free speech, until it's causing actual harm, that's fine. When we get into hate speech, there's this, in practice, if not legally, there's this gray area where, okay, my speech online, maybe it's not directly threatening someone, maybe it's not immediately inciting violence, but it is still can have a real impact on people out in the world if
Yeah.
I'm spreading hateful ideas. And that's not a legal question. That's, if we're talking
That's a
about,
moral question.
yeah, and
Right.
Well, and the hypothetical question becomes, what's the impact if I round up and I punch my fist and I stop an inch short of your nose? Like, okay, I haven't done it, but there's an impact on the person whose nose you came within an inch.
Well, there's intent to intimidate, intent to control,
Mhm.
intent to frame as far as media go.
Well, I make an argument though that for marginalized communities in America, hate speech happens every day, and it's commercialized and it's commoditized and it's promoted, and very often, if you don't feel like you're represented well in the media system or equitably in the media system, you are the object of hate, and that is a sort of a different issue than just the definition of individual words on a channel that people can hear, right? I mean, it's a question of whether or not you're the object of oppression in our society, right?
And I think that also gets to the question of, and one of the advantages of, I think, access centers is they've been thinking about these questions from the beginning. I mean, if you have something like Facebook, it's built on the premise of, we're a couple of college students who want to create a thing to, rate how attractive our peers are. And then it's built into this.
Women specifically.
Yeah, women
It was
specifically
exploitation from the
from
very
white
beginning,
men,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And then built into this platform for, let's harvest people's data as much as possible to profit off of. So they'll have terms of service around hate speech and content they want, but none of that is coming from the perspective of, what's the best way to tweak those rules to have, as much free and open discourse, while balancing the real world harms. And that's a tricky enough question, but that's not what they've been focused on from the outset.
Well, let me turn to folks in the room here and just kind of ask you a question, if I can, and I'd be kind of curious to hear what your perspectives are to share with the crowd. What is the greatest speech challenge that your community faces today? If you had to identify it. Yeah, and say who you are and where you're from.
Mike Flanagan, I'm up Shasta County up by South Oregon border, SCAC-TV. And so, because I feel like I'm right in the middle of it, the being a red city and a red county and a blue state. It's called a red, white, and blueprint. So what happened in our community was all the extremists just got tired. They totally bought into the media's fake, and they're angry, and so they started really just regurgitate. They learned a lot from their mentor about repeating lies over and over and over and over again. And with the decline, we only have a newspaper that looks like the size of a high school newspaper as our median. We do have two stations that are owned by conservative capitalist institutions. So we were getting fair coverage, so they were just repeating the lies. Nobody was checking it. And so our board, we were without an executive director after Deborah Lucero left for like 3 years. And so we had kind of a lack of leadership. Our board was only 3 people. And one of the board guys said, because they created this show called The Red, White, and Blueprint, which was their YouTube show that was just branding their making them even bigger, their reach. And Fox News is jumping on it. And all of a sudden, every day, I'm seeing my hometown mentioned in a bad light by these agencies. And my board guy said, hey, can we, I wasn't invited to the board meeting for whatever reason it was. And so it came up, we don't want that seen on our channel. And I said to the interim director, I said, well, I think, I'm still a newbie here, kind of at 5 years, 6 years. But I think that if they came to us and wanted us to show it, we would have to show it. We could decide when we would show it, but they never, and I reached out to them and said, you won't all show it on the channel. And they never got back to me because they don't trust media. But is that kind of like the hate speech you're kind of referring to? Because I feel like that kind of hate speech is just starting to blossom and maybe in timing to the next presidential election. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it certainly brings up issues of misinformation or disinformation, and it may occasionally cross over into hate speech depending what they're broadcasting. But it's interesting that you pointed out, for example, what time it's on. And I think there are those kinds of interventions, perhaps, that you can make without walking away entirely from the notion of people want a show and they're willing to produce it. We'll put it on.
I mean, I think it's a specific challenge too, because your board of directors, what is their tolerance for a range of expression in the community? And that's got to be a key question in terms of, and this pops up all the time, particularly with township organizations where they're running a combined channel. It's a PE and G channel, all combined. It's like out of a high school, for example. And there's something that's crazy that, well, that's a pejorative term. I should not use that word. There's something that's controversial that comes forward, right? And then this question is like, what's your tolerance for the diversity of expression in your community? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I know historically there have been instances, of, Klan programming where towns have chosen to, shut down channels as a response, because that's their tolerance. I mean, this is the simplistic answer, but, these are the kind of questions you want to be, prepared for in advance, because it's really a kind of existential question of what are we? Are we a forum where people with opposing views can come in, and even if we don't agree, our solution is to open the doors, let other people come in, respond to that, facilitate this, or is our role, we want to be, a source for local news that's more vetted, where in more of that publisher role, having an oversight. And, maybe there's a place for both, but those are two very different models. And I think playing both of them at the same time is where it gets really difficult. And I'm not sure you can. I mean, there's certainly space, and there should be space for people to come in, and these people have access to YouTube. It's not like you're the only source, but, is it better if they're just on YouTube where they get promoted to people and their views get amplified? Or is there value to having them, on the same channel where it can be programmed next to people with other views? People can come in the same place and see these things together.
I mean, the classic free speech model, as it were, or the place where you sort of run into the limits is the example that everybody knows. Are you shouting fire in a crowded theater and therefore people are going to gather in a mob and someone's going to get crushed? Because in that case, you've stepped outside of free speech because there's an element of danger that's been introduced. And so the question is sort of what is the speech example of shouting fire in a crowded theater? What does that look like? And how do you sort of trigger that point of what I would call responsible intervention, which is somewhere?
What is that in 2022?
Well,
Because no one's going to the theater.
no.
I'm sorry.
No. Well, let's say, for example, I'm just going to bring up like a random topic that probably comes up in Shasta and some other right-wing, because we were talking about this earlier, some right-wing channels. Pedophilia, right? Gets talked about a lot in a lot of right-wing communication of various kinds. And it gets talked about in a couple of contexts. One of them is probably elitist, Democrats, Clintons, pizza parlors, all that stuff. And another context might be, for example, with youth who are gender fluid or trans. And the question is, if you start to characterize people with power, remote politicians, as pedophilia, that's one thing. It may be crazy, but it's unlikely that anything is going to happen as a result. However, if you characterize gender fluid youth or trans youth who live in your community, who don't have that much power, as pedophiles, and one is just as crazy as the other, but there are implications about who's being put potentially into danger and who, and whose safety here is being questioned. And I think the useful part of the shouting fire in a crowded theater is the safety argument, which is basically, is there really a safety challenge being created by the speech that is here? And if so, is that something that we as a center have to take responsibility for just because we live in this community? And if violent and dangerous and scary things happen here that are driven by hate speech, that has an impact on the community. So I think sometimes the issue of safety and vulnerability is not entirely straightforward, but it is something that we have to look at as responsible parties. Because I would expect that if you played a show every single week that talked about how gender fluid youth are a danger to the kids in the schools, something might happen in some communities.
And I want to get to the other questions here from it, but the other thing I would say about the Shasta example that you're talking about is that you've got that hollowing out. To refer back to Antoine's discussion yesterday at the plenary, that sort of that meso level institutions that are meant to be able to help with that, with communities to be able to understanding themselves, you have less and less of that in your community. And if anything, that there should be a calling for your organization to be acting in that fashion as that intermediary that builds civic discourse. And I know that's kind of a highfalutin, abstract thing to say, but it gets to this question of like why you exist, as opposed to just we operate a channel, right? So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but.
Well, my strategy was just to counter, like I run Gay USA News, and so I run that either before or after it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I Yeah.
But from a practical perspective, I wonder when we do counter programming, do we become a publisher?
Well, you're
Have we-
making an editorial choice.
Have we crossed the line in a way that draws us into what theoretically was a black-white distinction?
Well, but an operator of a public forum does have the ability to have time, place, and manner for distribution. So,
But counter placement
okay.
is an act, an assertive act. I'm not making a judgment on it of appropriateness or inappropriateness. I'm just questioning then the logic and premise of how else do we apply that premise to address what we believe should be open, robust debate.
So
on the issue.
so you're telling me that I'm making an editorial choice if I have a caller call in to complain about a program and I say, I'd like you to create a program called What the Hell Is That?
No,
And then
I'm
and
saying
we'll
if
play it
you-
right
if
after your
you-
show.
If you go and
Right.
find that programming, well, that's another gray
That's what I'm
gray
saying.
area
That's what I'm
distinction,
saying.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
All right.
Right.
So
Oh, am I offended by it? And so as operator of the organization station, take the assertive act to go find some programming. Oh, look, I can search on Peg,
Yeah.
right, and find something. Or do I say, oh, you who represent that aspect of speech within our community, I can give you tools to address this. I'm showing there's a distinction there,
Yeah.
potentially.
Hey, Richard, I wanted to ask.
So actually, I'm gonna kind of open it up. We got about 10 minutes left before we have to go. So I want to open up for other folks if we can here. I mean, what kind of challenges do you, Roger, why don't you go ahead and identify yourself for everybody in the room?
Roger, I'm from Bolello in Honolulu. And I think that they put scary things about free speech, talk about all the value of it. It is so important in our society. But free speech is by its very implication on the premise. So there's parts of this, canceling, on platform. We're the last place that isn't canceled. So in some ways, we are the last bastion of free speech on the electronic platform. I was gonna say, somehow we struggle with this, but we have to be very careful, because we have the last place where those marginalized voices stand up to be heard. So I guess I'm just saying, we're trying to be very careful that, sometimes, well, no, a lot of times, we're gonna be publishing things that are on the platform that frankly, we don't like. But that's why we're there, in my opinion.
Go ahead and again, identify yourself for everybody.
We do have in Fresno a producer who makes a program called Weaponized News. And he has been deplatformed from YouTube and told our programming coordinator, thank you for continuing to show my program. I've been kicked off of YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and everything. And you guys are the only ones who still take my video. And I don't agree with anything he's ever said on this show. And we created a splash screen to play in front of his program that states that the following program does not reflect any of the views of the CMAC channel and organization. It is odd to see it on the channel, or, just walking down the hall and seeing it on our TV and it's like, oh man, I don't agree with anything he is saying. But yeah, I do appreciate that we can offer this platform. I would not want to draw a line in the sand and tell them you can no longer play your content and then have to create some sort of publishing arm and editorial arm to determine whether or not. So it's tough, and I know that there were some conversations among our staff when he told us that we have to figure out a way to separate the entity from the content.
Well, let me ask a question of you, Kyle, and then maybe we can get some response here. So does CMAC specifically promote the idea that they are a forum for other people's expression in your branding and your promotion? Or is that just a splash page that you put up before his broke ass program?
There were other programs that we also put that splash screen in front of when
But is that just a way to shield yourself, or is that part of a positive message that you have about your role in the community? That's the question I've got.
Right. And I'd have to raise the question, why isn't it in front of every program?
Yeah,
Okay,
thank
all
you.
right.
But the
Yeah,
executive director,
But I will tell
the
you.
executive
I'm glad
director's
it
voice is heard,
I'm
heard
glad the
muffled in the
answer is
background.
that it is, but I know in my own staff's response to content that they see coming that they know is potentially controversial is like, oh yeah, we've got that. We have to put that disclaimer thing up before the program, right? So the natural intention of defensiveness, we have to be wary of, that it does not in some way then marginalize a speech in some particular fashion, right? So.
We also do run counter programming around the
Mhm.
yeah, we are making a decision.
Right. So in a comparable
Yeah.
way, do we have to be
Welcome.
like, Twitter or Facebook that says, oh yeah, these facts have been disputed? We have to have that little disclaimer,
Well, welcome to the world of shades of gray, right? Okay.
It makes that, just to jump in, it makes the trust part different with the community at large.
Mhm.
When you've got this particular access producer who's doing this controversial show and he's out there saying, hey, this is the only platform that'll take me, and you've got someone else saying, why are you giving a platform to neo-Nazis? Why are you giving a platform to this type of speech? And we're losing trust with
It,
community because of our kind of, it looks like we're enabling.
is it, here's my question to you, and this is not to put you on the spot, but it's sort of a question for everybody. Is that then the only thing you're known for? Hopefully not. I mean, but I think this is the problem sometimes, is that folks aren't known for anything other than the awful. Right? And then they become branded
Well,
with that, right? I mean, and I think that's been a historical problem for many of our organizations, right?
and
So you go ahead.
just
Tracy.
to open up the window a bit, we had a diversity panel yesterday that a lot of you were at. And we had a long talk about doing the internal work and a welcoming environment. And we have to balance that with, oh yeah, we have neo-Nazis on the TV. Like there's some contradictions there. And I just want us to sort of hear and acknowledge those contradictions.
Right.
I don't have all the answers,
Right.
but I mean, geez, I don't feel welcome in a station that's playing lots of neo-Nazi programming. Why would I with my last name? And it doesn't, there are other goals that we have as organizations as well. And if we let free speech absolutism become the only good, I think there are some other goods, and community trust is one of them that can also become challenged.
We've got a couple more questions in the back here, and I want to be respectful and hear them before our time's
Sorry.
up here. I saw Brian. Go ahead and then identify yourself for everybody in the room.
Yeah, years ago we had,
And speak up a little bit.
years ago we had some controversy around nudity and sexuality and all of this. This is the thing that brought us up in front of the city council. And it was really funny because people would call in and complain, and I'd say, well, this is free speech. And they'd say, well, then if neo-Nazis want to come and make a show, are you going to give them a platform too? And I'd say, yeah, it's protected speech. So yeah, it's free speech. And I would go through the whole FCC ruling, rules and everything. And I'd say, but the good thing is that now you'll know who the neo-Nazis are.
Well,
Yeah.
this was a specific thing that showed up in it was a Massachusetts community this last year, where there was a live school board meeting that happened like Wednesday mornings from 6:30 to 8:30, right? And you had a paid member of the school board come on and in a live discussion talking about issues going on in the community. I can't remember the community in Massachusetts. He ends up using an anti-Semitic slur for the former superintendent live on air, and he's being interviewed by two folks from the district, and nothing happens for like two 2 hours
Mhm.
after, he uses this anti-Semitic slur. And over the course of 48 hours, a protest movement erupts to be able to oust the school board member, and he resigns 72 hours later. And I'd submit to you that that's a success for free speech, because you had a forum that basically outed this weasel, and then he was paid to represent the people in the community, and there were consequences of his actions as an elected official. Right now, I mean, I don't know if that's cancel culture, Mickey, but I think that's an effect that speech has for how communities work and monitor themselves, isn't it?
We've certainly heard the term consequence culture, also counsel culture. These are opportunities, right? If you go and look at the late great Thich Nhat Hanh in The Art of Communicating, when we say something that nourishes us and uplifts the people around us, we're feeding love and compassion. When we speak and act in a way that causes tension and anger, we're nourishing violence and suffering. So I'm coupling that with everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. Of course, that's the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19. And I would rather know what my neighbor thinks and what they're doing and what they're talking about, so that I have the opportunity, or others in the community have the opportunity, to use these channels to educate and raise awareness around an idea. Why is this idea particularly toxic? Why is this harmful? Where is that line? Where does it cross? It's not an easy decision for these local channels to say, you can have this channel over, you can have this show over here, but then not over there. This almost sounds like reductionism for some, but Noam Chomsky once quipped when he was writing a rather banal foreword to Forisot, who was a Holocaust denier in France, said you can have two positions on free speech. You're for it or against it. And if you don't have free speech principles intact for thoughts and ideas you hate, then you probably don't really respect why this kind of free speech and expression is important. I think UN Article 19, really is a high bar to live up to, but I think it's the right one. And I think that since corporate media don't, I think it's really important that community outlets really uphold those kind of principles, because it's clearly at least one thing that sets them apart. And it also is a much better access point for diversity in community that you do not and will not see in the corporate press. That's why these local media outlets are so significant and important in my view.
Well, we've run out of time here. We're going to end it on that note. I want to thank everybody for being a part of the discussion here today. Mickey Huff from Project Censor joining us from somewhere in California. Actually, I know where you are actually. Jeff Bain from Spiegel McDermott, Richard Turner from Community Media Center in Westminster, Maryland, and Tracy Rosenberg from Media Alliance. Let's give them all a round of applause. Two other quick thanks. Thanks to Chris Verdugo for the technical work on today's production. And I'm glad we actually were able to hear Mickey. So thank you, Chris. And thank you to both our sponsor for this session, which was Telview, and to Swit Electronics, which provided the camera, which allowed Mickey to be able to see you, which will be actually given away later today as a part of the vendor showcase. So a big round of applause for everybody who helped make this happen.
Thanks, everybody.
I think our next sessions are at 10:30. Please go ahead and enjoy the rest of the morning.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks, everybody. It was an honor to
Thanks,
be here.
Mickey.
All this hardiness.
Okay, here we go. Wine basket on its way out the door. Who's gonna take it home? Oh, Sue, these are the registrations from when to when?
From the beginning till February 28th.
All right.